Welcome to A Game of Grief by Sylvester A. Hansen. In this presentation, I'll be talking about the motivation I had for creating this project, then I'll be talking about the scientific base going into interviews, then I'll talk about the product, which is a game and a strategy guide, and then I'll conclude on the entire matter. Now, about a year and a half ago, I lost an aunt to cancer. The illness came very suddenly, and before anybody really knew what had happened, she was gone. And I watched the immense effect that grief can have on a family. And this was never more apparent than in her three teenage sons, who had no way of dealing with this immense loss that they had just suffered. Watching their reactions, I desperately wanted to help, but being equally unprepared myself, I was unable to, and this is where a strong motivation came to try and help people in similar situations. So I started out by looking into professionals in the grief management field, and I came across the 5 stages of grief by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. The first stage is denial. It is this idea that whatever has happened hasn't happened, and that person that you've lost will just appear through the door as if nothing had ever happened. Next up comes anger, and with anger comes blame. You will start blaming yourself for a sibling or a parent or a physician or God, and you will become very angry with that person, and that can be very destructive to a relationship. Next up, you have bargaining. Now, bargaining is this irrational idea that you can somehow still reach that person, maybe through doing all the chores that they ask you to do, or scrubbing the soles of your shoes for half an hour. Is this idea that they are not unreachable. Next up, you have depression. Now, there's a common misconception that depression and grief are synonymous. This is not the case. While depression is a large part of grief, it is not grief itself. Lastly, you have acceptance. Another misconception here is that acceptance means a happy stage. It means that you're done with grief, that you can go on with your life and be happy. It is less that and more the acceptance that your life will never be the same. You're accepting the fact that this has happened to you and that you will never be able to undo what has happened. Next up, I looked into my target group and grief, and I looked into a guy called Edle Dyrkol who has written about children and grief. And what he wrote about was the difference in how boys and girls handle grief. Now, he says that girls are predominantly social in the way they grieve. They grieve in groups and they seek out professional help, whereas boys are less social. They might become introverted, lock themselves in both metaphorically and physically. With this in mind, I set up a group of interviews. Firstly, I interviewed a psychologist who has been working with grief for almost 12 years. Then I talked to my grief-stricken cousins to really get an insight into what grief does to a person. And lastly, I visited a boarding school to get an insight into my target group. Now, I talked to Rita Poulsen a couple of months ago, and she really opened my eyes to what grief is. Now, she explained that grief happens mostly in a dual world. On one side, you're introverted, you are in an introspective world. You look at that person and you look at what you lost and you go through those 5 stages of grief. And on the other side, you're reconstructive. You try and rebuild that life you had. You may go to school, you may do all of those things that you did before and might even seem to enjoy them. Now, there's a common and very destructive misconception that if somebody isn't grieving 24/7, that they're not actually in touch with their emotions. Now, this is, of course, not true. The fact that they're trying to rebuild their lives means that they're actually doing something actively to remain ahead of their grief. Next up, I talked to my 3 teenage cousins, ranging ages 18 to 13, to really understand grief. Firstly, there's the eldest of the 3. Now, he's been very open about his grief from day one. He has talked a lot about his mother and what she meant to him, and that has made it very easy to communicate it with him. Next up, we got the middle cousin, who has been less talkative about his mother. Whenever he talks about his mother, it is in short, emotional bursts that can be infrequent and very hard to really see when are coming. Lastly, you have the third cousin. Now, he's the youngest of the three and also the least talkative. He has not talked to me about his mother, and even in a seemingly open situation where we were in an interview and we all had lost somebody we cared about, he didn't talk about his mother at all. With this in mind, I really wanted to see what can my Thai group actually comprehend. So I visited a boarding school for free-form education dealing mostly with music and theatre to really gauge my target group. Now, what I had expected was that they would be very closed off. They would be very straight and narrow. They wouldn't think in terms of narrative very well. So what I wanted to do was create a workshop for them in terms of a role-playing game in which they were actually encouraged to use their imagination to build on the story. And what I realized is that my target group is actually they're very abstract minded. They think in metaphors and abstractions, and this really opened up the project for me, and I was very happy to have this experience. So with that in mind, I created a project statement. Now I wanted to create two products that mirrored the Rita Poulsen two stages of grief, the reconstructive and the introspective. So in the reconstructive phase, or in the reconstructive part, you have a game, a classic video game that hopefully the title would pick up even if it weren't for their grief. And next up, you have a strategy guide that talks to them about their grief, sort of a strategy guide to their emotions, as it were, that really talk to them about grief. So for the game, there is a link in the description to a small introduction to the game, so I encourage you to check that out. Now the game takes place in a world that has been attacked by a toxic gas produced by a volcano eruption on Iceland. Now most of Europe had been attacked. We meet our main character Lee as she is trying to evacuate her city together with her mother. Unfortunately, they're unsuccessful in doing so, and Lee wakes up in her own apartment unsure of what is real and what isn't. Now the way that I've designed this game is through those 5 stages that Kubler-Ross talks about. Lee will have to ascend this apartment building floor by floor, and each floor will correspond to a level in those 5 stages. So the first level is the denial level. Now here Lee has just woken up from what she believes to be a dream, this idea that this gas didn't happen. She looks out the window and realizes that this gas did happen and in fact is blocking off her way to the lower levels. She can't get out of this apartment building. The only way that she can get out is to reach higher, to go to the roof and hopefully be rescued by a helicopter. So Lee is stuck in her apartment. She's actually locked in together with this unseen evil presence that is seeking to attack her at any stage. Now there are 2 ways to get out of this. Either Lee manages to find a key to actually get out of her apartment, or she is attacked sufficiently that she is actually knocked out by this presence. Now based on how well the player actually plays this, whether or not he actually makes his own way out or is attacked enough times to be expelled from this stage, will actually have an effect on the player later in the game. Now in the second level, Lee has made her way out into the hallway, and it is filled with viscous, mucus-filled monsters who are all attacking her unceremoniously. Now Lee will have to actually go through these in sort of a hack and slash manner. She has to, very classic game style, just kill as many monsters as she can to make her way across this hall and to the emergency exit. Again, based on how many or how few monsters she actually kills, she is rewarded, or the player is rewarded, by the end of the game. Now next up we've got the bargaining level. Now on the bargaining level, Lee is confronted with a number of locked doors, all of which have a small card attached to them telling Lee, if you do this action then you will get in. For instance, if you go down to the anger level and kill a certain number of monsters, you will be able to get in here, whereas other doors will actually be a bit more cruel in their intent, saying if you, and it is up to the player to make the right bargains to ascend to the next level. Now the next level is the depression level. Now the depression level is visualized in terms of a maze or a labyrinth. Lee will have to navigate her way through several very difficult challenges to make her way to the 5th level. And based on how quickly or how slowly she actually ascends this level, she's again rewarded by the end of the game. Now the 5th level is the acceptance level. In this level, Lee has finally reached the roof, and this is where, based on how well you did in the previous levels, you will actually be rewarded. If you made the right bargains, if you spend the right amount of time in denial or depression, you will actually be rewarded with certain rescue. She will get to the roof and there will be a helicopter waiting for her. However, if you did less well, you will face certain death. So it's important that the player really experiences this ascension in the right manner. Now with that in mind, I created a strategy guide. Now the strategy guide again is sort of a strategy guide to your emotions. It's where you are able to talk about your own emotions and be educated about them. So the introduction is sort of an explanation of what this book is. There's a preface explaining what this book wants to do and how it's attached to the game. Of course, it's attached to the game through the narrative that I just explained. There's also a possibility of you actually checking off each chapter as you've done them. There'll be exercises in each chapter, and just for you to keep track of it, you can actually check them off in sort of little boxes. Now, firstly, you'll have to write a contract. This is nothing legally binding. This is merely you saying, I want to be helped. I feel like I need it and I want this book to help me. It is just you sort of making an agreement with the book. This is also where you're encouraged to actually tell the book, okay, so you want to help me? What do I want out of this? What is my angle to this? Now with that, we go into the first narrative chapter. Now I've created small narrative chapters throughout the book that explain something about the narrative in the game, so that the teenager is not just confronted with a whole you have to do this, there's a small give and take. Now this first narrative chapter is where you learn about the main character Lee. Now on one page here we have her passport that sort of explains sort of basic information about her height, weight, age, and next to that you have a cartridge for the game. So the next spread here is sort of a little story in which Lee's mother has received a letter from Lee's school telling her that Lee has been skipping classes to hang out with friends. And on the opposite page you sort of have Lee's reaction, which is a text message conversation between her and a friend talking about how big of a bitch her mother is. So that goes into a discussion of who you were. Who were you before this immense experience happened to you? And you're sort of encouraged to sort of check out these characters on the 14th page to really examine, does this look like you? This is also where you're encouraged to write a letter to your former self, sort of embracing that person and telling them this is what you have to look forward to. Now the next narrative chapter is called The Toxic Threat in Your Self-Protection. It is this idea of a pamphlet that would be sent out to every household were a catastrophe of this magnitude actually to occur. So you have evacuation routes and side effects and all of these different sort of emotional things, or sort of things that a family would have to be aware of. This goes into precautionary tales, something about the volcano that has erupted, and even some statistics that tells you which countries are most affected and which countries are least affected. This of course goes into sort of a story about reactions. What was your first reaction? And you're encouraged to sort of draw that face. What I experienced when actually researching this was that everybody remembered that first day, that immediate reaction almost, almost like a small movie that was running through their head. So I thought I would actually discuss that. So in conclusion, what I created was a dual product that dealt with the reconstructive and the introspective parts of grief through several other theories, such as the 5 stages of grief. And I created this to really help teenage boys who are trying to deal with grief, to really educate them as to what is grief and what are they going through. So I will thank you for your attention, and I hope that this was enlightening for you.